I have spent more than 4 decades sitting behind the same wooden bench, listening to the same shuffle of shoes across the courtroom floor, watching people walk in with stories they hope will save them from a fine, a penalty, or sometimes from their own mistakes. After all those years, you start to believe you understand patterns. You believe you can read a person the way a librarian reads the title on a book's spine. Most days, that instinct is right. But there are rare mornings when someone walks through those doors and reminds you that no matter how long you have worn the robe, you still don't know everything about people. One of those mornings happened on a Tuesday in early autumn. I remember it clearly because the courthouse always smells slightly different when the weather begins to cool. There's a faint mixture of old paper, polished wood, and the coffee our clerk insists on brewing far too strong. My father used to say that the smell of a courthouse was the smell of responsibility. He told me that long before I ever became a judge, back when I was just a young law student trying to understand the weight of justice. Remember, he would say, the law is written in books, but justice lives in people. That advice has followed me into every courtroom I've ever worked in. That morning started like hundreds of others before it. The clerk, Mrs. Alvarez, was already at her desk before I even stepped into the courtroom. She always arrives early, long before anyone else, and she has a habit of studying the case files with the same concentration a teacher might use grading final exams. When she looked up at me over the rim of her glasses, she gave the small nod she always gives, the silent signal that everything was ready for the day. "Light docket today, Judge," she said. Those words are usually a relief. A light docket means fewer arguments, fewer people angry at the system, fewer moments when someone's life changes forever in a single sentence spoken from the bench. I took my seat, straightened the stack of case files in front of me, and glanced through the list. Most of the cases were routine matters, minor traffic violations, parking citations, a few disputes that would likely resolve themselves before lunchtime. After enough years on the bench, you learn that 90% of court business is ordinary. It's paperwork, procedures, and people hoping a judge will show them a little patience. One case in particular caught my eye, but only because of how ordinary it seemed. A simple citation, the kind of case that normally takes 5 minutes, a small fine, a quick explanation, and then everyone moves on with their day. I have handled thousands of cases just like it. My father used to tell me something else whenever I complained about the dull parts of studying law. He would smile and say, "The small cases matter just as much as the big ones, sometimes more." At the time, I thought he was just trying to encourage me. It took me many years behind that bench to understand what he meant, because every once in a while, the smallest case file can carry the heaviest story. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and people slowly filtered in through the doors. Some looked nervous, others looked bored. A few looked like they had rehearsed speeches in their heads all morning. Mrs. Alvarez sat quietly beside me, typing notes into the system as the first names were called. I have worked with her long enough to recognize her expressions the way a conductor reads a musician's cues. Most days her face is calm and neutral, but every so often she tilts her head slightly when someone approaches the podium. That tiny gesture means she has noticed something unusual. I didn't think much about it at first. The early cases moved quickly, exactly as expected. A few drivers apologized. One man tried to argue with the officer who wrote his ticket, though his argument collapsed almost immediately when the evidence was presented. The courtroom followed its usual rhythm: questions, answers, rulings, the quiet scratch of pens on paper. Then the bailiff called the next case, and the moment the defendant stepped through the aisle toward the podium, I heard the faint shift of Mrs. Alvarez's chair beside me. I glanced at her. She had tilted her head. The man who stepped forward moved slowly, not in the hesitant way of someone afraid, but in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has learned to live with pain. Every step seemed measured, as if the floor itself might shift beneath him if he moved too quickly. He held a dark wooden cane in his right hand, worn smooth along the handle by years of use. When he reached the podium, he paused for a moment, catching his breath before lifting his eyes toward the bench. I have seen thousands of people stand in that exact spot. Some arrive angry, some arrive embarrassed, others try to charm their way through the process, but this man didn't seem interested in any of that. He simply stood there, straight-backed despite his age, waiting for the proceedings to begin. I glanced down at the file in front of me. A minor citation, a violation so small that it normally disappears from memory before the day is over. "Good morning, sir," I said. "Please state your name for the record." His voice was quiet but steady when he answered. "Daniel Carter, Your Honor." The name itself didn't mean anything to me yet, but the way he spoke it did. There was a calmness there, a certain discipline in the tone that reminded me of the way soldiers sometimes speak, carefully, clearly, without unnecessary words. Mrs. Alvarez had stopped typing. I noticed that out of the corner of my eye. It takes a lot to interrupt her routine. "Mr. Carter," I continued, "you are here today regarding a citation issued last month. According to the report, you were parked in a restricted emergency access lane outside Mercy General Hospital for 42 minutes. The fine attached to that violation is $80 plus administrative costs." I closed the folder gently. "Do you understand the charge?" "Yes, Your Honor." There was no argument in his voice, no protest, just acceptance. That alone was unusual. Most people begin explaining immediately why the sign was unclear, why the officer misunderstood, why the rule should not apply to them. In 40 years on the bench, I've heard every variation of that conversation, but Mr. Carter simply waited. I studied him more closely. His jacket was old but neatly pressed. The collar had softened with age, yet it had clearly been cared for. His shoes were polished in the careful way older men sometimes polish their shoes, long after anyone else would bother noticing. My father used to polish his shoes the same way on Sunday mornings. I don't know why that memory crossed my mind just then, but it did. "Mr. Carter," I said, "can you explain why you parked in an emergency lane for that length of time?" He looked down briefly, his hands resting on the top of the cane. "I needed to be close to the entrance, Your Honor." "That area is reserved for ambulances," I replied gently. "There was a public lot less than 100 yards away." "I know, sir." The courtroom was quiet now. People waiting for their own hearings had begun listening. "And yet you chose to park there anyway." "Yes, Your Honor." He didn't rush to defend himself. He didn't search for excuses. He simply acknowledged the rule the way someone might acknowledge the weather. Mrs. Alvarez glanced up at him again, that same thoughtful tilt in her posture. I leaned forward slightly. "Were you visiting someone at the hospital?" "Yes." His answer came quickly this time. "Family member?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough to carry weight. "No, Your Honor." "Friend?" He took a slow breath before responding. "Yes, sir." I nodded, though the explanation still left questions. "Was this person ill?" Mr. Carter looked up at me then. His eyes were clear, but there was something tired behind them, something that felt older than the years on his face. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Very ill." The courtroom remained silent. Even the faint clicking of Mrs. Alvarez's keyboard had stopped. I glanced once more at the citation report. The officer had written it like any other violation: vehicle description, location, duration, the standard procedural language that fills thousands of reports every year. But reports never capture what happens before or after those 42 minutes. They only capture the rule that was broken. "Mr. Carter," I said, "how long were you inside the hospital?" 42 minutes, he replied. The same number written on the ticket. "And why exactly did you need to be so close to the entrance?" He tightened his grip on the cane slightly, not in anger, more like someone preparing to lift something heavy. Then he looked back at me. "I was saying goodbye, Your Honor." For a moment the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. In my years on the bench I have heard many explanations, some honest, some rehearsed, some so creative they almost deserved applause. But there was something about the way Mr. Carter said those three words that carried a weight far beyond a parking violation. I leaned back slightly in my chair and studied him again. "Saying goodbye to whom, Mr. Carter?" I asked. He took a slow breath as if choosing his words carefully. "His name was Samuel Hayes, Your Honor." "Was he a relative?" "No, sir." "A long-time friend?" Mr. Carter hesitated, then shook his head gently. "No, not exactly." That answer caught my attention. People usually describe someone clearly in moments like this: brother, neighbor, friend from work. The uncertainty in his voice suggested something more complicated. Mrs. Alvarez had stopped typing again. She does that when she senses a story forming. "How did you know Mr. Hayes?" I asked. Mr. Carter looked down at the floor for a moment before answering. "We served together." The way he said it carried a quiet familiarity that needed no explanation. My father had that same tone whenever he spoke about men from his own service years. Some bonds are formed in places where ordinary friendships cannot exist. "In the military?" I asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "What branch?" "Army." I nodded slowly. "And you hadn't seen him recently?" He gave a faint shake of his head. "Not for a very long time." "How long?" Mr. Carter's fingers shifted along the handle of his cane, tracing a groove worn into the wood. 42 years. The number hung in the air. 42 years. Almost the same amount of time he had been parked outside the hospital. I noticed a few people in the gallery leaning forward now, their earlier boredom replaced by curiosity. "Help me understand something," I said gently. "You served together many years ago, but you hadn't seen him since." "That's right." "So, how did you know he was in the hospital?" Mr. Carter reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of newspaper. The paper was creased so many times it looked ready to fall apart. "I saw this," he said, holding it up slightly. The bailiff stepped forward and handed it to me. It was an obituary notice. Samuel Hayes, age 79, former Army Staff Sergeant. The short paragraph described him as a decorated veteran who had served with distinction during a conflict overseas decades earlier. There was a line in the notice that caught my eye: "Recognized for extraordinary bravery during a roadside attack that saved the lives of several fellow soldiers." I looked back at Mr. Carter. "You saw this and decided to visit him?" "Yes, Your Honor." "After 42 years?" "Yes." There was still something missing in the story. Most people would have reached out long before then if the bond had been close. Yet Mr. Carter had waited more than 4 decades. "Mr. Carter," I said, "may I ask why you hadn't contacted him before?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the windows along the courtroom wall, where morning light stretched across the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I didn't think I deserved to." The words settled heavily in the room. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. Mr. Carter shifted his weight slightly, as if the memory itself required balance. "That day they wrote about in the obituary, the attack." He paused again. "That was the day he saved my life." A faint murmur passed through the courtroom. I felt my father's old words echo somewhere in my mind. "The law is written in books, but justice lives in people." "Tell me what happened," I said. Mr. Carter lifted his eyes back to the bench. "It was a convoy patrol," he began slowly. "Hot afternoon, dust everywhere. The road looked empty." His voice carried the distant rhythm of someone stepping back into a moment frozen in time. "We were riding in the second vehicle when the explosion hit. Several people in the gallery shifted uneasily. The blast flipped the truck. Fire spread fast. I was trapped under the frame. Couldn't move." He swallowed. There was gunfire coming from the hills. I could almost see the scene unfolding in his memory. "Most of the men ran for cover," he continued, "but not Sam. He tapped the cane lightly against the floor. He ran straight toward the fire. The courtroom had gone completely still now. He pulled one man out first, then another. Then he came back for me. Mr. Carter's hand tightened around the cane. The truck was burning by then. Everyone was yelling at him to leave it, but he didn't. He lifted his gaze again. He dragged me out seconds before the fuel tank exploded. I felt the room hold its breath. "That's the story they printed," he said softly. "But that isn't the whole story." The room stayed silent after Mr. Carter spoke those words. But that isn't the whole story. I had heard many people describe moments from their past, but there was something about the way he said that sentence that made it feel unfinished, like the end of a chapter missing its final page. I leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean, Mr. Carter?" He looked down again at the worn wood of his cane. For several seconds he said nothing. The quiet in the courtroom grew heavier, the kind of quiet that makes people forget about their phones and their paperwork. Finally he spoke. "Sam saved 3 men that day," he said. "That part is true, but the report made it sound like we were just soldiers caught in a bad moment." He lifted his eyes toward me again. "We weren't supposed to be there." A faint ripple moved through the gallery. "Explain," I said. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. "Our unit had orders to avoid that road. Intelligence said it wasn't safe, but I was the one driving the lead vehicle." He paused again, "and I made the call to take the shortcut." The weight of that admission settled across the courtroom. "I thought I knew better than the map," he continued quietly. "I thought I could save us 20 minutes. He ran his thumb along the smooth curve of the cane handle. "That decision put us directly over the explosive." For a moment he closed his eyes, as if seeing the moment again. "When the truck flipped, I remember thinking it was my fault. Every bit of it. The fire, the chaos, all of it." He opened his eyes again. "Sam knew it too." The courtroom remained completely still, but he didn't say a word about it, Mr. Carter added. Instead, he ran back into that fire and pulled me out. I felt something tighten in my chest as I listened. My father used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing someone else's life over your own safety. Looking at Mr. Carter now, I could see that lesson playing out in a way that had lasted far longer than any military medal. "So after that day," I said gently, "you carried the responsibility." "Yes, Your Honor." "For 42 years." He nodded once. "I told myself I didn't deserve to face him. I figured if he saw me again, he'd remember that it was my decision that put everyone in danger." He glanced briefly toward the gallery. "But when I saw the obituary, I realized something." "What was that?" "That if I didn't walk into that hospital room, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether he knew how grateful I was." The words hung in the air. "So you went to see him," I said. "Yes, sir." "And you stayed 42 minutes." Mr. Carter nodded again. 42 minutes. The same number written on the citation in front of me. "What happened in that room?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. "I walked in and introduced myself," he said. "At first he didn't recognize me. 42 years changes a man." A few quiet smiles appeared among the people sitting in the gallery. "But then he looked closer," Mr. Carter continued, "and he laughed." "He laughed?" I asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "What did he say?" Mr. Carter's voice softened. He said, "Took you long enough to visit." The tension in the room eased slightly. "And then?" I told him thank you. His hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "I told him that because of him I got to watch my children grow up. I got to retire. I got to see my granddaughter born last year." He paused again. "And do you know what he said back to me?" I shook my head. He said, "I never saved you, Daniel. We saved each other." Mr. Carter swallowed. "He told me he knew the road decision was mine, but he never blamed me. He said every soldier makes choices in the moment, and sometimes fate chooses the rest." The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the courthouse lights above us. He squeezed my hand before I left, Mr. Carter continued, and he told me something I'll never forget. What was that? He said, "Don't spend another 42 years punishing yourself for one bad decision." I felt my father's voice again, somewhere in my memory. Justice lives in people. I looked down at the citation on my desk. $80, parking violation, emergency access lane, 42 minutes. I lifted the paper slowly and looked back at Mr. Carter. "Sir," I said quietly, "you understand that the rule exists for a reason." "Yes, Your Honor." "And technically you did violate that rule." "Yes, sir." The courtroom waited. I held the citation between my hands for a moment. Then I folded it once, twice, and set it gently aside. "Mr. Carter," I said, "some people come into this courtroom asking to avoid responsibility." He stood still, listening. "But you came here carrying responsibility for 42 years. I shook my head slowly. "I think that's more than enough." For a few seconds after I spoke, no one in the courtroom moved. Mr. Carter stood quietly at the podium, his hand still resting on the top of that worn cane, as if he wasn't quite sure whether he had heard me correctly. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. After carrying a burden for so long, people sometimes forget what it feels like when someone finally tells them they can set it down. I looked at the citation one more time. $80, 42 minutes. A rule broken outside a hospital entrance. Then I looked back at the man standing before me. "Mr. Carter," I said calmly, "this court understands why the rule exists. Emergency lanes must remain open because lives depend on it, but justice also requires us to see the whole story behind the moment." The courtroom was completely still now. Mrs. Alvarez had her hands folded in front of her keyboard. I had worked beside her for many years, and I had seen her sit through thousands of cases without showing much emotion. But that morning, I noticed the faint shine in her eyes. "On the day you parked outside that hospital," I continued, "you weren't trying to avoid responsibility. You were trying to close a chapter that had followed you for more than 4 decades. Mr. Carter swallowed quietly. I picked up the citation again, then set it aside. "This court dismisses the fine." For a moment he didn't react. Then his shoulders lowered slightly, the way someone relaxes after holding their breath too long. "But, Your Honor," he said softly, "I did break the rule." "Yes," I replied. "You did." He nodded once. "I'm prepared to pay the penalty." I leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Carter, sometimes the purpose of a courtroom is not simply to punish a violation. Sometimes it is to recognize the human story behind it." I paused for a moment. "You spent 42 years believing you owed a debt you could never repay. Yesterday you walked into a hospital room and paid it with something far more valuable than money." His eyes dropped to the floor. "You paid it with gratitude." The words seemed to settle gently across the room. A quiet sniffle came from somewhere in the gallery. I couldn't tell who it was, but I understood it. I looked at the bailiff. "Case dismissed." The gavel struck once. Mr. Carter stood there for a moment longer, as if the sound had not fully reached him yet. Then he lifted his head again and gave a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. It wasn't the loud kind of gratitude people sometimes express in court. It was quiet, almost careful, like someone handling something fragile. Before he turned to leave, he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He raised his hand slowly to his forehead and gave a brief salute. It wasn't directed at me. I realized that almost immediately. It was meant for someone else entirely, for a man who had run toward fire decades earlier. I stood from my chair and returned the gesture without thinking. The courtroom stayed silent until Mr. Carter reached the door. After he stepped outside, the normal rhythm of the court slowly returned. Papers shuffled again, chairs moved. The next case was called. But something about the room had changed. Even Mrs. Alvarez sat a little quieter than usual as she began typing again. Later that afternoon, as the courtroom finally emptied and the sunlight faded through the tall windows, I found myself thinking about what my father used to say. The law is written in books, he told me once, but justice lives in people. It took many years behind that bench for me to truly understand those words. Because sometimes a case is not about a parking space or a citation number. Sometimes it's about a promise that waited 42 years to be spoken out loud. And sometimes the real purpose of a courtroom is simply to listen long enough to hear it. If this story made you think of someone who helped you in a moment you never forgot, take a moment today and tell them. Don't wait decades the way Mr. Carter believed he had to. Life moves faster than we expect, and gratitude, when spoken at the right time, can lift a weight someone has been carrying far longer than they should. Thank you for being here and hearing this story with me. And if you'd like to hear another story from this courtroom, one that involves a young woman, a broken bicycle, and a lesson that changed an entire neighborhood, you might want to stay close. Because sometimes the smallest cases end up teaching the biggest truths.